yes, thank you very much. It's Mordam Shin, Gomorphy Comínagat, and Curum Falcha Rivenera. Thank you, Cahirdach, for allowing me to raise this important matter in relation to autism and school support, and thank you to the Minister for attending to take this. As the Minister may well be aware, there has been an increased attempt over the course of the last number of years to integrate children with an autism diagnosis into mainstream schools at both primary and secondary level. And I want to acknowledge at the outset that much of this work has yielded positive and transformative outcomes, not only for the children concerned, but also for the schools who have had their learning horizons significantly expanded. That being said, there remains significant and to some extent growing concern around the effective curtailment of access to school hours through the application of what are termed reduced timetables. As I understand it, the Department's view on reduced timetables is that they should not be used as a behavioural management technique or as a de facto suspension or expulsion, nor does any legislative provision exist for the use of reduced timetables for particular pupils or groups of pupils. So we're talking about here a situation where the state is resourcing schools, but where, because of behavioural issues or whatever, the children in need of support are not getting it because they're being put on reduced timetable. The Autism Support Organisation, As I Am, made it clear in its submission to the Oireachtas that there is problems here. This is their submission to the Oireachtas Joint Committee on Education and Skills in late April, and again only recently here at a briefing in the AV room. From its own consultation with parents, autistic children and teachers, As I Am concluded that the use of reduced timetables was and is being used as a de facto behavioural management option, with the obvious outcome that children are being denied access to class time. And they say that this is mainly down to the failure of the department to ensure that schools are sufficiently autism friendly. It's one thing to provide funding and resources, it's another thing to ensure that there is delivery. As I Am also noted that there are what might be termed regulatory lacunae, in the sense that while there is a commitment on paper to adapt the school environment to its autistic students, this is not always given practical effect, either through lack of training, or because of lack of training, or inadequate psychological support structures. I might also note, Cahirdach and Minister, that Pavey Point has independently arrived at pretty much the same conclusion with respect to traveller children. Ms Maria Joyce of Pavey Point told the Joint Committee on Education on the 30th of May that the issue of traveller children on reduced hours has almost reached the point where it has become policy rather than an exceptional measure for a child with particular needs. So this is being resorted to far too easily and is not being used as a last option. So I'd ask the Minister if she would accept that the exclusion of access to classroom time is almost at the point of becoming systemic within schools. She also accepts that unless and until more effective autism supports are put in place within schools, that the problem is likely to become embedded and thus far more challenging to reverse. So ultimately, I suppose it's a question of whether or not we're genuinely committed to ensuring that these children are made to feel welcome in the school environment, despite the very real challenges that this often presents for school staff who are, in fairness, committed and dedicated. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Senator. And, I suppose I will answer to the best of my ability, and where I can't, I will certainly respond to you. But just from my own point of view, and this is something I think we all work with parents, we all work with and try and provide the best level of care, but ensure that absolutely every student is given access to the supports that they need and that are relevant to them and that are appropriate for them in any type of school as well. So I think it's important to note that the government is absolutely committed to that, as I think every single person in this House and in the Dáil is too. But I want to thank the Senator for raising this issue, in particular the challenges faced by children with autism in getting an education. The Joint Oireachtas Committee on Education is publishing its report today on the use of reduced timetables by schools and the impact that this has on children with special educational needs. The Minister for Education and Skills and his officials will be considering the views of the committee over the coming weeks, and I'm sure will revert back to you, Senator, and to everybody in this House. Enabling children with special educational needs, including autism, to receive an education is a priority for government. This year we will invest €1.8 billion on providing support for children with special educational needs, and this includes additional teachers and additional SNAs. It includes an allocation of over €300 million towards providing additional resources, and that's specifically to support students with autism in schools. The greater proportion of children with autism attend mainstream classes, but of course some students may find it difficult to manage full-time placement in mainstream, and so placement in special class or special school settings is sometimes deemed more appropriate for them. Enrolment of a child in a special class or a special school placement is based on a professional assessment in consultation with the National Council for Special Education, or the NCSE. The National Council for Special Education is responsible for planning, it's responsible for coordinating and advising on educational provision for children with special educational needs. The Council is currently planning to ensure that every child has a school placement appropriate for their needs for the 2019 and 20 school, and the Department is working closely with them in this regard. Since 2011, just to outline maybe a few facts, the number of special classes has increased significantly from 548 in 2011 to 1,459, so almost 3 times across the country, of which almost 1,200 are autism spectrum disorder special classes. In addition, there are currently 124 special schools, of which 20 cater exclusively for children with autism. The NCSE team of Special Educational Need Organisers, or CENOs as we all know them, are locally based. They are available to support families of children with special needs and to work with them. The National Educational Psychological Service supports, or NEPS, children with ASD, including those who may also present with anxiety. This may involve in-depth consultation or an assessment, or building school capacity to better understand triggers, interventions, solutions and strategies, of course, in response to presenting needs. The Department and the NCSE provide a range of supports, including professional development, advice and guidance for schools and teachers in relation to teaching children with special needs. Schools are required to have policies in place. These are required to support students who experience difficulties with impacts on their ability to fully participate in school life, and as we all know, intervention at an early stage is key. Reduced timetables should not be used as a behavioural management technique or as any kind of a de facto suspension or an expulsion. There are legal provisions around the exclusion and expulsion of students, and these are the responsibility of TUSLA. Notwithstanding the Department of Education and Skills, they are aware that the reduced timetables are being used in certain circumstances where it may not be considered the most appropriate means of dealing with the behavioural issue. The Department of Education and Skills in that regard is working with the Department of Children and Youth Affairs and with TUSLA on the development of guidelines for schools on this issue. In conclusion, the Minister, and I've spoken to him on this issue before, is anxious that every child's entitlement to education is vindicated. This means that children are supported to ensure maximum attendance and participation. I'm satisfied that the necessary legislative framework and the structures across both government departments and their agencies are in place to deliver on this important objective. Thank you.
Supplementary, Senator.
Thank the Minister for her response. I suppose in all human affairs there will always be a gap between rhetoric and reality. It's inevitable. I suppose what we have to work to is to narrow that gap as much as possible. And you know, to be somewhat parochial for a moment, if I may, in December of 2018, the Galway Autism Partnership, which provides a service to 200 families, appealed to all Oireachtas members to make representations to the Department on its behalf. As I understand, its unit, based in Athenry serving Roscommon and Galway, had no service at all for people with autism for the whole of 2013. Its most recent report is from 2017, and it highlighted the fact that it receives no state funding and relies on extensive fundraising, donations from members of the public and corporate sponsorship. I'd hope that that situation can change, Minister, and obviously you won't have that information to hand, but I'd be grateful if I could be reverted to on that. And I raise that point because it highlights in another way the gap between the rhetoric of the state with respect to autism support and the reality on the ground. I accept that there's a commitment to the principle of subsidiarity at play. That's commendable, but parents and students need the commitment at local level to be reciprocated at the department level. So the issue I raised today refers to reduced timetables. It's really a question of how allocated resources are being used or not used. But it links in with the issue of the allocation of resources itself in other situations. Both have to do with the need to narrow the gap between rhetoric and reality on the ground. Thank you.
I suppose just again I'll have to come back to you in terms of funding of specific organisations. It's not something that I can comment on here. There are organisations throughout the whole country, including my own constituency in Meath, that really do absolutely fantastic work in supporting parents and families and schools and teachers and young children in particular with autism, and it's important to acknowledge that and to support them where we can. But in the specific issue that you've raised in terms of reduced timetables, again to stress that the Minister is aware of this, that this is a concern that he's aware of, that it cannot and should not be used as a behavioural management technique or any kind of a suspension or expulsion, as well as that. And in that regard, he's working with, and his department are working with TUSLA to try and address those concerns. There has been a significant increase in supports, but also funding made available. And you're right, it's important that that money actually reaches the students that need it, and that it's applied appropriately. And everything that the department is doing is to ensure that that is the case. But if there are concerns or specific issues or concerns, obviously it's important that you or anybody else can raise them and make the Minister aware of them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Senator.